All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 11, talking about regulations and rules and laws and all of that sort of thing. And, of course, whenever you get the government involved in something, there's all sorts of things that you have to follow and keep in mind. So let's dive in. First off, what are the regulatory influences? Well, as it comes to the federal government, everyone's got their hands in it in one way or another. We start off with the executive branch. The President of the United States enforces the laws passed by Congress and makes appointments to federal agencies such as the FCC, and those appointments are made with what is known as the advice and consent of the Senate. Basically, what that means is that the President picks the person that he or she wants to put into a certain position, and then the Senate will review that decision and approve or deny it. By appointing the FCC chairman and other commissioners, the president directly influences media policy. Because more often than not, when the president chooses someone to fill that role, that person is going to be somewhat sympathetic to some of the agenda points that the president has and the way that the president wants to run things. As far as the legislative branch goes, in the House, the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology are the primary committees that enact media legislation. And in the Senate, the Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, and the Internet has jurisdiction for legislation relating to numerous areas of communications, in addition to, as we just talked about, confirming appointments to the FCC that the president makes. And then the judicial branch. Usually appeals of any FCC decisions are going to be heard by the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals. Sometimes, though, they can go directly to the Supreme Court. And then whatever the court says is going to have final authority on that particular case that is brought before them. The role of state and local law. The big thing to know here is that state and local laws do regulate certain aspects of communications and media policy in coordination with national policies. By and large, what we're looking at when it comes to rules and regulations come down on a federal level, but there are some state and local rules that are going to affect broadcasting, such as any rules regarding real estate, especially when it comes to placement of antenna towers and things like that. Also, local governments have a lot of influence when it comes to cable television, for example. So it's not just a federal thing, although that's what we tend to focus on quite a bit, and that's the focus of this chapter. But there may be rules that are impacted by various organizations on the state and local levels. As far as the FCC, let's take a little bit of a look back in time. Broadcasters attempted self-regulation early on in the 20th century, doing so with a series of national radio conferences. However, what happened was they couldn't really come up with a consensus on how to self-regulate themselves. What was happening was that a lot of different radio stations were just popping up, and there was lots of interference from one station to the next, and it was becoming rather cumbersome. So basically, this is something that we don't see a lot of in history, but in this particular instance, we see broadcasters asking the federal government to step in and asking the government to regulate radio by establishing policies for station licensing and operation. So as a result, we see Congress coming up with the Radio Act in 1927. The Radio Act created the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC, and by doing so, Congress recognized the scarcity principle. Basically, this is the idea that people would want to engage in broadcasting, but there's only a limited amount of frequencies available. So just because somebody wants to get on the airwaves doesn't necessarily mean that they can. So regulations were put in place to determine how people would be able to operate the airwaves. The 1927 Act introduced a rather important principle that is still pretty much held as a cornerstone of broadcasting today, known as PICON for short. PICON basically serving as a acronym for public interest, convenience, or necessity. So the idea that those that hold a broadcast license need to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. That has very much been a hallmark of broadcasting ever since the 1927 Radio Act. In 1934, Congress passes the Communications Act, which established the FCC to replace the FRC. The FCC became an independent agency with the power to regulate communication. And various rules and such has been passed down from the FCC regarding radio and then later on television. Once cable television coming along, getting its hands in that to a certain extent, and then eventually coming online with rules for telecommunications, for satellite, and most other communications. The FCC now has at least some hand in. The next biggest change that we see in terms of how communications are regulated comes in 1996 with the Telecommunications Act. The Act's primary goals were to promote competition and reduce regulation in order to provide lower prices and better services to consumers and to encourage the growth of new technologies. So the big thing that is known from the 1996 Telecommunications Act is this idea of deregulation. There have been lots of rules that have been passed over the past 60 years or so, and there was some sense that perhaps those rules were preventing the advancement of technology and the advancement of services, that it wasn't economically viable in certain situations. So the Telecommunications Act attempted to address that particular problem and try to spur on competition and technological growth. Among the many provisions of the Act include these changes. National ownership limits for radio were removed, while ownership limits for television were enforced through an audience reach cap. Secondly, open competition between the cable and telephone industries was stimulated, so each one could dabble a little into the products and services of the other. Television manufacturers are now going to be required to include the V-chip in newly manufactured television receivers. This would allow viewers to block programs that contain sex, violence, and strong language. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now let's take a look more at some of the contemporary things that the FCC has put forth. Going back a little bit in time to the 1970s, once again, we see a period of deregulation. Some of the things included in the actions back then were the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine. This had required broadcasters to present programming that covered controversial issues in what was deemed to be a fair and balanced way. An easy way to talk about the Fairness Doctrine is to think of equal time when it comes to presenting an issue in light of side A versus side B. It was removed because some broadcasters had felt that it was really taxing to try to present both sides of a particular issue for the same amount of time as another side of an issue, and it actually inhibited the ability to create compelling programming for its audience. Community ascertainment requirements were also eliminated. Broadcasters were once required to gather opinions from leaders in the community that they served regarding issues of importance, and then they were expected to offer specific programming to address those issues, and that would be normally done by way of a news segment or public affairs programming. Other aspects of deregulation, programming quotas for news and public affairs, those were eliminated so that there still has to be public interest programming that goes on in order for a station to meet PICON requirements, but there's nothing specific that says you have to have X type of programs or air them for a certain amount of time or minimum time interval or things like that. License renewal procedures were greatly streamlined, and this also resulted in the length of license increasing for radio and for television stations. Currently, a license is held by a company for 8 years. Other deregulation includes elimination of the FinCIN rules, FinCIN standing for the Financial Interest and Syndication rules. These rules had restricted networks from having a financial interest in the programs they broadcast or from having syndication rights. So when the FinCIN rules were eliminated, this basically allowed networks to be able to own their own television stations. It allowed networks to own their own distribution companies for programming. So it was really the beginning of the ability for media companies to envelop vertical integration. Also, new technology development. The FCC began serious efforts to develop new communication technologies by encouraging the growth of digital television, digital audio broadcasting, and the participation of telephone companies in distributing video programming. The FCC did take a tough stance on indecency following the 2002 and 2003 fleeting expletives during the Grammy broadcasts, and also in 2004 the infamous wardrobe malfunction during the CBS Super Bowl halftime show. These incidents, along with the FCC's numerous fines for radio shock jock Howard Stern, left many questions as to what constitutes indecency. How do we define that word? And that became an issue of debate for a while. So the issue made its way to the courts, and what wound up happening was that the Court of Appeals found that the FCC's indecency rules were unconstitutionally vague. Then the FCC tried to take the issue to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided not to hear the case. So what basically happened was that the fine that was levied against CBS wound up being vacated, and the FCC was required to develop stronger standards in order to measure what was indecent and what was not. Then in the Obama years, we saw more of an emphasis on broadband development, which continues to be a thing to this day. And we also saw the rise of net neutrality, which was around for a few years and then was not. And we'll get into that more a little bit later. Right now, though, we're going to take a break, and we will continue on with the notes when we hop over to part B of Chapter 11.